Oh, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to open this keynote for the Young Scholars Symposium organized by the Center for Global Asia. I'm Callie Wong, Assistant Professor of Global Chinese Study. I'm speaking today as the chair of the NYU Shanghai READS program, and I'd like to begin by thanking CGA and also Anna for making this co-hosted event possible. It's a wonderful opportunity to bring the READS program into the conversation with broader intellectual community gathered here. This year, our program selected Chop Suey USA, written by Chen Yong, to encourage us to think about restaurants as more than just sites of food consumption. It frames them as spaces shaped by migration, labor, and cultural exchange, institutions where everyday practices reveal broader social dynamics. Professor James Ferrer's talk today extend and deepen this perspective. By focusing on neighborhood restaurants in Tokyo, his work shift our analytical lens towards what he described as economies of care. These are spaces where the proprietors are not only producing meals, but also cultivating relationships, sustaining micro-publics, and participating in forms of community infrastructure that are often overlooked in conventional urban research. Seen together, our READS program and today's keynote invites us to reconsider the social life of restaurants not as peripheral or informal, but as central to how communities are formed, maintained, and understood. So here I also want to invite Jing Tong, who co-chaired the READS program here with me in NYU Shanghai. I would want to invite her to speak a few words about our program.
Thank you, Carly. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tong Jing. I'm the Director of Academic Resources from the Academic Resource Center, and I also co-chair with Carly as the chair for the NYU Shanghai READS program. So this is the program that is designed to spark intercultural communications among the NYU Shanghai community. So each year we select a book and then we ask the entire community to read the book, and then we organize a series of programming events throughout the year to allow our community members to talk about the themes in the book and exchange intercultural communications. So we will have three upcoming events in April. So one is about Chinese representations in U.S. Chinatowns, and the second one is that's on April 15, and we also have an event on April 22nd that is exploring transcultural identity through the lens of food. And then we have one more last event in the week of April 25. The topic is wide study of food, family memory, and connection across borders. So we will invite faculty and staff and students to share their experience about the food and how this, how they relate to their intercultural experiences. So you're more than welcome to participate in our future events in April. We will have more events details on our website and the Engage web pages. Okay, so I'll hand over to Anna to introduce our speaker.
Okay. So it's my great delight to introduce my old friend, James Ferrer. Beyond his many accomplishments that you can read about in his bio, James has been an inspiration to me for a number of reasons. First, he's a fabulous scholar. He is rigorous and careful and serious and thoughtful and always curious. Second, he's deeply engaged in two of the great cities of the world, Shanghai and Tokyo. Third, and this is why it's so fitting that he's keynoting this conference for young scholars, James' work teaches one of the most important lessons of all: research, write, and teach about what you love. James has spent the last decade that I've known him, or it could even be decades, doing exactly that. He research, writes, and teaches about sociability, sexuality, nightlife, and food, all the things that make up the livelihood, liveliness, and livabilities of the great cities that he is so immersed. What guides his work is an unending inquiry into the most critical question of all. How is it that the places that we live, local and global, our neighborhoods, can help foster our relationships, our happiness, and the good life? Today, James is going to walk us through his incredible project about what he has convinced me, and I'm sure will convince you, is one of the world's great neighborhoods. That is his own neighborhood in Tokyo. So thank you so much, James.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this. And what a wonderful program you're describing about food, and to be talked about or to be part of something where people are reading the great book, the Chop Suey book. It's a wonderful book. And so I do hope I have a chance to come to some of the events that you're going to be continuing to talk about food studies here. Actually, my connection with food studies and urban studies has a lot to do with NYU, and I've worked with NYU people over many years, including Anna, and also over in New York with Krishnendu Ray. And so people, it's really wonderful to be back here. I've come back to NYU Shanghai many times, and even back when it was way over on the other side of the city in the East China Normal University campus. So today I'm going to be talking about my own work and situating it a little bit in the context of how we can think about not only what ethnography is, but what ethnography does. So let's see if I can get this thing to should work, right? Is this one? Where's the best way to go? Up. Okay. All right, so here we are. So first of all, I want to be talking about what is in fact a public ethnography. So this is a 10-year-long study. It's a study of a single neighborhood in Tokyo, really. So it's classic urban ethnography, the kind that I was taught to do back at the University of Chicago many years ago. There is in a sense, we sociologists talk about samples. I've have an interview sample of 100 restaurants, and actually many, many more people that I've interviewed individually outside of those case studies, and a lot of participant observation where I keep going back to places and talking to people. And just to let you know what kind of restaurants I'm talking about, they're not super expensive. There's an average check of 1,000 yen to say 6,000 yen. So it's not very high end. These are not fine dining places by and large. And what I'll be talking about separately, and actually sort of in a sense after the main part of this talk, is the concept of public ethnography and what I'm doing here. And this is a lot based on my Shanghai experience. As I was working in Shanghai for 20 years, I always regretted the vast amount of material that I produced as an ethnographer was not shared. Most of it ends up, sort of on the cutting room floor of the process of writing. And what I wanted to do in Tokyo was to share this with people in a much fuller way. So I created this public ethnography website to do that. We have articles in English and in Japanese. It started out 10 years ago, so it's largely text-based. It's not video-based. There's, in a sense, a kind of community feedback loop where we get, because we're doing this in Japanese, we're getting the feedback immediately from people in the community who are telling us what they like and dislike about the articles. Also, it's a chance for us to meet new people. And it is actually a chance for us to provide visibility for micro businesses. As you will see in ethnography, these places are very small, marginal businesses. It also becomes then an entry point into participation in community life. So not only through the web page and through this kind of ethnography that I'm talking about, but actually much beyond that into other aspects of community life I'll talk about later, including ultimately, I think, sort of co-creating this idea of what the community really is. And I think this becomes then this kind of co-creation of an urban imaginary. It comes down in a sense to something similar to what Gibson Graham talks about, and this idea of collaborative knowledge production that emphasizes the grounds of possibility of alternative economies. So it's about understanding what is possible as an alternative economy in the city. So what are the different ways we can produce sort of, in a sense, non-market or non-capitalist forms of business? So I'll be first talking about the ethnography, this idea of craft as care or alternative economies of gastronomy, and secondly, talking then about the promise and perils of public ethnography. So I'll get on to the first part. So there's really sort of two faces of Japanese culinary craft. When I was starting out studying food, it was in Shanghai. And it was actually Shanghai chefs. I was here doing fine dining research. I was talking to people on the bun, and they would say, "Oh, wow, you're coming. Why are you talking to us? You're coming from the great food city." And the image they had was these sort of shokunin, these these people that are able to do something with food that's really amazing, and it was a lot of respect for them. So I guess the image of that was this sort of Jiro dreams of sushi, $300 omakase menus, exacting standards, elite clientele, and long periods of training. And that's the image we have of the Japanese craftsman. I think we still see that written about quite a bit. What I'm actually going to be talking about is what I would call B-grade craft, and it comes from this term BQ gourmet in Japanese, or this sort of B-level gourmet. And this is an idea really of, which is represented by this young woman I'll be introducing later called Meg. And she does sort of cheap food, home-style cooking. And she says her goal is to create a place where the little birds can play. That is, everybody can have a good time, and there are no hawks, so nobody picking on other people. So the idea for her is about creating a safe social space. It's not about being the perfect cook. So her idea of what she's crafting really in this case are community relations, not objects of art. So the central research questions here are: what are the social meanings of craft? What role do culinary workers play in producing a community? And what kinds of informal social infrastructure arise when formal institutions fray, right? So, and there is a background here that's very important, and that is the fraying of formal institutions in Japan, or what we often think of as a kind of arising of a precarious economy. And so in that sense of an economy in which people lack stability and lack, in a sense, anchors, neighborhood restaurants function as kind of micro-publics that provision emotional, practical, and relational care to an increasingly atomized urban population, which is what I'm calling craft as care. And we thinking, in a sense, sort of rethinking craft work. So I really want to move away from the image of craft work as being about people working with things, or the relationship of people to an object, which is simply then produced as a kind of object of art, to people thinking about craft as primarily relational, which is the way that my informants, or the people that I work with, talk about it. It is related then to a specific urban context, which is often described, or sometimes described, as a kind of degraded gentrification, or almost like an anti-gentrification, as when people are, in a sense, moving from, we do have urban renewal, we have the renewal of buildings, we have, in a sense, the removal of some businesses and replacement with others, but not necessarily the upgrading of facilities that you might associate with gentrification in, say, New York City, in a similar type of neighborhood. And there's also a kind of fragmentation of properties. So there's a lot of detail about the urban context that I'm probably not going to be able to fully explain, but we could talk about it later. And then there's the concept of care economies, which I'm coming at partly through recently reading feminist economics perspectives that talk about alternative ideas of alternative economies within a broader capitalist economy. And then this idea of gendered emotional labor. So there's been globally a craft renaissance, and this is something I think especially we see in writing about New York City. So if we had to sort of parallel this, if you think about the neighborhood I'm talking about, it's kind of often described as the Brooklyn of Tokyo. So in some ways, it's kind of the cool, trendy part of the city, but it's also a kind of, a somewhat outside of the main sort of high-end part of the city. It's not the Manhattan of Tokyo. And in this kind of place, we have this idea of university-educated people picking up craft jobs. And this is what we're seeing. So a lot of the BQ gourmet people I'm talking about, these are the BQ craftsmen. These are, in fact, people that went to university. So they're not coming from working class trajectories. They're sometimes coming from other jobs. There's a great deal of people falling out of the white collar employment and saying, I don't want to do that anymore, and going into running micro businesses. There's a notion of people then, basically trying to find a new career in this economy. But the difference, and if I wanted to sort of contrast my findings with those in the U.S., I would say that in the U.S. case, there's much more focus in the literature on this idea of the chef as a creative career, on individual expression, the idea of I'm going to express myself through this career. I'm going to do something that requires expert knowledge and artistry, and a kind of boundary work. That's what Richard Osejo talks about as boundary work, which involves hopping from job to job in order then to build one's own individual capital. Whereas in the Japanese case, what we see is sometimes rather similar, but I would say the chief difference is less of boundary work. So there's a less of an attempt to distinguish oneself from people that do, in fact, service labor, and actually much more of a focus on the service labor. So the idea that I'm actually distinguishing myself from people who do ordinary cooking is not really the story that people tell. People aren't coming here and saying, I'm actually really an amazing exemplar of say, craft cocktail making. That, I think, is less common. It's far more, in the narratives that people give me, what they're talking about largely is sustaining social ties. And the narrative that they give often comes down to something like, we might talk about as omotenashi, this idea of deep empathy with the customer, and it's very much community oriented. So that would be perhaps, if we wanted to say, a distinction with the findings that are in some ways similar in the U.S., but I think a difference that'll come out a little bit more in the ethnography. So the larger urban context is also similar but different. So if we said again, there's a kind of neo-Bohemian story, and this term of neo-Bohemia is something that comes from the Chicago case. If you've been to Chicago, it's the neighborhood of Wicker Park was the sort of original neo-Bohemia, place where all the artists and young people who want to get into the creative economy would go live. These people were often associated with the process of gentrification, right? So these are people that actually forward gentrification in the neighborhood. We see this, of course, in New York City. This is widely studied in the literature on cities. So people like Sharon Zucken have written about this. And I would say in the Tokyo case, there are some distinctions. So we see a similar process of a kind of neo-Bohemia and young folks who are highly educated, who are not taking part in the formal economy, and are in fact running small, somewhat, I guess, precarious businesses. The big difference, I think, is in the way in which the state and capital approach the neighborhoods. First of all, there's far less of a state-led infrastructure renewal. So if we contrast it with Shanghai, the contrast is enormous. So in Shanghai, you have the full-scale removal of entire neighborhoods and replacement then with very large-scale property developments. In Tokyo, this does happen, but it's rare. In this neighborhood, it's almost non-existent. You have more plot-by-plot, small-scale development. So you have then legacy populations that coexist with these new populations. So there's a much slower replacement of the pre-existing social structure. And so one thing that happens here in this sort of Chuo line area of Tokyo is that alternative business models tend to develop side by side with very old-fashioned craft culture. So there is not a complete replacement of one with the other. And this has, I think, been largely the phenomena that we see. The other thing is that because of the macroeconomic situation in Japan, we've had a price deflation for 30 years, the loss of real estate value for 25 years that sort of bottomed out in around 2018. And that really allowed these small businesses to develop for decades without the rental pressure, the upward rental pressure that you would say see in Shanghai. So there is a big macroeconomic difference. And there is some change recently with rising rents and greater threat of redevelopment. So that's sort of the larger context. I would say that the idea here then that I'm pulling in from this idea of feminist economics and urban sociology are four basic ideas. And so one is this concept of relational commitments. That is, craft is motivated by sustaining social ties rather than individual expression. This is a point I've already made, I guess. The other is that urban fragmented property markets enable care-centered businesses despite the precarity. So in other words, there is actually a low-rent market. There is, in a sense here, a response to what might be thought of as the larger context of demographic atomization. And I think this is a point that I haven't brought up until now, and that is, in the Tokyo context, what we see is, and I don't have a graph here, I do in the actual written version of the paper, we see a huge increase in the number of people living alone. And so the number of people living alone in the neighborhood, it drives then a new type of participation in urban life. So people are often there trying to find places to find a home. So there is an audience, or I guess a market for care, and a decline then of family care, of family-based care, a decline of extended families, a decline of eating at home, and many people that are not in relationships, are not married, have never married, and so there's a lot of need for a type of care environment that then is outsourced, in a sense, to small businesses. And this is a kind of gendered emotional labor in which, but it's a gendered emotional labor in which we have both men and women providing it. I just think they provide it in somewhat different ways. So we have male and female proprietors who work in these businesses and sustain community despite actually a lot of personal cost in doing so. So I guess the key point is that small restaurants function as infrastructures of care during this kind of urban atomization. So the atomization, I think, has two levels. One is a decline of social infrastructure. So there's a decline of traditional social infrastructure, such as neighborhood associations, decline of business associations. So the traditional neighborhood infrastructure of Tokyo life is declining, and it's being replaced by a kind of informal infrastructure that's provided by the market. And it is actually a kind of precarious infrastructure. So the case is located in Suginami-ku, which is in the 23 wards of Tokyo. It's on the very western edge of the city. And it's an area of the city that has a lot of dense, low-rise built environments, right? So this is the area that I'm going to be talking about a lot, is this one single small plot of land that has 56 businesses in an area that's about the size of a football pitch. These are all very tiny micro businesses. So there's an element of material infrastructure here, and that is small micro parcels, rents that are low, dense agglomeration of businesses that are working together, and a pedestrian scale, sort of walkable scale. And then there's a social infrastructure that is access to relationships, this kind of culture of bar hopping across the businesses, a lot of collective events that they've organized through interpersonal relationships, and a sense that everyone is connected together in a kind of high trust, in a rather high trust environment that has been created by these small business owners and their customers. So I'll give you then case studies to really talk about what am I actually talking about here. So the first is, and often when I've done this in other contexts, I tend to usually show videos because I do have a lot of videos I've made through the television shows that we've done about the neighborhood, but it's a little, I don't really have time to show those today, but this is one person that we interviewed, Megu, and I like to introduce her because it's a very, very recent interview. And she is a young woman who was actually trained as a kindergarten teacher. She talks a lot about her training as a teacher, taking care of children. She opened up during COVID. She runs a standing bar. She got cheap rent. And she's the one that talks about, she named her bar Takanashi, which means no hawks. And she says that means there's no hawks to pick on the little birds that are out drinking in her bar. So the idea is let's have an environment in which we create a safe space where every one of the little birds can come and drink. That's what she said. And it's a pun in Japanese that's kind of strangely, it's actually it has from a kind of, if you saw the written version, it's interesting because it actually really does. It's called Xiao Niao Wan or Kotori Osobi, and it actually is read Takanashi, which means no taka, which no hawks. So it has a sort of yomikata it's actually in the dictionary too. So it's an interesting word. So the community building that she engages in is quite extraordinary. She talks about, she organizes events for the neighborhood. She actually organizes a bar crawl. She's actually trying to expand her business. And when she talked explicitly about expanding her business in order that she could create enough scale so she could provide maternity care for her employees, because she has a lot of people that are going to then, she thinks maybe want to have children, and maybe then they'd be able to take time off. And so this is actually, by the way, a central problem of these small businesses. They're very small scale, extremely small scale. So it's usually one or two people. And because they're so small scale, they're not sustainable from an intergenerational point of view. In other words, it's very, very hard for people to have children and run these businesses. So many people just simply don't have kids, or they stop having businesses, or they simply struggle mightily to manage. It's very hard for them to manage. So in that sense, they're not sustainable. The other thing she's talking about doing is providing elderly care services as a formal business, because she's already providing elderly care services informally to her customers. So this is one of the things that these businesses provide. Many of the customers are quite older. So you might expect when you're looking at these photos, and I think if you're coming from many cities, you might look at these photos that this is young people's culture, but it's not. Many of the people that are coming to these bars are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And hers is a young crowd. She also gets people in their 20s, but it's very rare. Most of the other places I'll be talking about, the owners are middle-aged and above. So this one is another type of business, and I think it's an important type of business to talk about in its context of what is meant by alternative economies. And so there's actually quite a few cases like this. So these are a shared space businesses. So someone starts a business and then they have multiple people working in the same space. So they share the space over a week. You might have 5 different entrepreneurs who will share this space during the course of a week. These are people that often have either other jobs, or maybe they are homemakers. They have taken care of children, and they will come and simply work only on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. And they are trying to then create a place where they can, basically gain some experience, gain some extra income. The person that talked about this space, though, is also himself a corporate dropout. And he really designed this, he says, as a place of care. So he says, people are exhausted. I wanted a place in daily life where people could rest for a moment before going home. So it's a kind of idea of an urban third place. But it's an idea then that also, he says, has to work for the people making the food as well. So one of the key parts of this type of social sustainability that I'm talking about, or this type of urban economy, is it's not just a kind of nice urban third place for the people that drop in or for middle-class consumers, but also a place where the people who are working there and making things themselves are also feeling that they are, in a sense, having a rewarding emotional experience. And he himself tries to help people start out businesses. He introduces them to rental properties in the neighborhood. And then his graduates from his business will start out their own small businesses in the neighborhood. So he has a kind of real estate broker. And he also works in another much larger business that's similar to this one, where I also have done a lot of field work. And this is a community center that is another shared space. And we also, in that community space, organize a lot of political events, like when we have mayor's elections, the mayoral candidates would come and give talks. We have different types of community events that then would not be possible in a place like a Starbucks. So it's impossible to organize a political event in a chain restaurant in Tokyo. They would not allow it, but we can organize these in these micro spaces. So this is the type of small business that is emerging, that is a shared space. I'll also then emphasize the next type of space. So the next type of space actually has a very different social history than the ones that I just mentioned. So this is, you might say, if we were going to talk about this in terms of temporal order, this is the first, because this is the old-fashioned model, maybe. This is Nami-san, who's probably my closest informant and a very good friend, who takes care of my life in many ways. And she runs a tiny little 7-seat bar. And most of her customers are men above 60, 70. She also, though, has about 30% female customers now. And she says, even the head of a company feels lonely. I let them know someone here remembers you. Someone here is thinking about you. It feels like coming back to your family home. And I know that sounds a bit like a cliche. You might read that in a Starbucks ad or something. But there are many people who come to her restaurant who actually have no other social support network at all. So some of the regular customers there, that's it. This is the only place they really feel that they have that takes care of them. I've sat there and watched her give counseling to people, very personal counseling about their real deep problems that they're having in their lives. These are people that are often elderly men who no longer have any intimate ties with other people. They're not married, or they're divorced, or they never got married. And so especially these lonely men, I think, are her main clients for what is in fact kind of almost psychotherapy. And of course, a lot of drinking. And often psychotherapy here goes hand in hand with a lot of alcohol consumption. So there's also an element of alcohol dependency. And so I don't want to paint over that and make this all sound completely wonderful, because the alcohol dependency becomes a big problem for a lot of people, especially actually for the people working in the industry. She, like a lot of the small bars, she organizes events. This is something that I was really surprised about. And I think for those of you who think that this is just the same as stuff you've met in other places, I'm wondering if when you go to your restaurant, have you ever traveled with the other customers in your restaurant on trips abroad? That's what people do. They will actually go with the regular customers and take trips. The little Korean restaurant across the alleyway from her will organize trips to Jeju Island. The Thai restaurant will organize trips to northern Thailand. And so the social relations amongst these regular customers are very, very thick. Nami-san does not take us abroad because she doesn't have a passport and she's never traveled abroad. But we always go on a moon viewing festival in Saitama, where she's from. One of the things, when you go and you're regular in a Japanese bar, when people stop calling you by your regular name and call you by a nickname, so everyone has a nickname. So there's sort of democracy of the bar. And we do a few things. And the other thing that I find really peculiar about her place is that she is a rather conservative person politically, I would say. And many of her regular customers are as well, but then she will include all sorts of people within her community in a very, I would say, democratic fashion. So we have foreigners who are non-Japanese people, as well as people who are Japanese. We even have one regular member of an organized crime gang who shows up with free fish all the time and gives us all fish. But we also have people who are very liberal and highly educated folks as well. So it's an interesting little tiny micro community of people. Finally, I want to talk a bit about just another example of what goes on, I think, with these folks who work in this kind of business. So this is about a woman who named Zushi Aiko, and she is a philosophy graduate. Her restaurant was my favorite, other than Nami's place. It was a wonderful place. A lot of professors would go there. People would talk about literature. She had a degree in philosophy. She would argue with you about different writers and how useless Murakami was and how awful. And she didn't like his books at all. So she would have a really interesting conversations with people, but then she just said she couldn't stand it anymore. She says, I couldn't bear to open too often. Many customers have no interest in listening to me. I think they come to this sort of place to be heard themselves. Seems sort of obvious, but for her it was rather hard. I mean, she felt at some point that this was too much, and she was diagnosed with depression. Alcohol was a real problem. You drink a lot in this business. She couldn't not drink, so she just had to take a break, and she shut down. At one point, though, she talked about her regular customers being so burdensome. There was one, she went to an Engiri shrine where you actually write a little futa to cut the relationship with that person. She wanted to get rid of this customer, so she went to the shrine and wrote his name on there and burned it, and he disappeared. So she thought she got rid of this customer, but it wasn't enough. So I do believe that one of the things about her, and I found this interesting because she closed and stopped her business, but she really saw this as a successful way to deal with her problems. And she was able to then keep working another job. And I think this is something I saw women were able to do better than men. So I never met men who shut their business. And so what I tended to see with men who they died of alcoholism, basically. Whereas I think women were better able to pull away from their problems. So like Nami-san quit drinking 10 years ago. She doesn't drink at all. And I think there are several women who I've seen who quit drinking. So you can go to their bars and they don't drink at all. But many of the men have trouble. But that is, I think, a bit of a problem. So we can talk then about what is the difference between what men and women do. I think in the old days, if we'd have gone to this place 30 years ago, this was all women. There was a massive number of women working there. And in fact, it's a fascinating story that I don't have time to get into, but they had a whole organization of women working. They even had a women's matsuri where the women would carry the shrines. And it was really a woman's world. And the customers were almost all men. So there the sort of gendered labor was women taking care of men's needs. And so Nami-san is very much in that model. But nowadays you have many, many more men taking care of women's needs. You have many women who are coming there alone, drinking, and the men sort of listening to them. So I think there's much more of it going both ways, but you still see different patterns. So you'll see on the women's side, you'll see more of this maternal nurturing. You'll see much more eroticism and touching and hugging, and women using sort of eroticism, and also men expecting that. You see much more kind of companionship and much more emotional availability. Women are much more emotionally available. On the men's side, what you see is much more still the traditional artisan showing that they're good at what they're doing, talking about how the wine that they're selling, talking about the sushi they're making, where the fish come from, much more that traditional display of expertise. And one of the things I think men tend to do with their female customers is listen, which is, of course, I think something maybe they don't get much of at home. So the men do this, and it may seem passive, but I think many of them are good active listeners. They're not talking as much. So this is kind of what the men do. One thing I see with men in this business, though, is men actually are much more likely to succumb to severe problems of alcohol abuse than women in this business. So the other thing that I'll skip over the details, but I've gone through a lot of the budgets with them. And one of the things I've realized is that by and large, these businesses are economically very, very precarious. The amount of money they're making is basically, in many cases, below the poverty wage, below the level of what people can, in fact, survive on. And so there are some that make enough money to live off of comfortably. And there's a few that are actually profitable, like Megu, the one I introduced at the very, very beginning, case number one. She's actually quite profitable. But others, like Nami-san, works also on the side as a house cleaner. These are very much people living in precarious jobs. So how do people survive? I think one thing is, in some ways, there is a lot of collective risk management. The neighborhood takes care of itself and takes care of each other. This was much stronger in the past, and people like Nami-san will complain bitterly about how people don't take care of each other as well as they used to. So there is, in a sense, a atomization of the community. But I would also say new forms of care emerge. People like Meg organize different types of informal community ties that are perhaps not as strong as what Nami-san experienced 20 or 30 years ago, but still there. There is space sharing. These kind of shared space environments are useful because it gives people a chance to enter the economy. There's network building that I think people will do, share regular customers. They'll even introduce customers to other restaurants. There's a lot of people organizing events outside of the traditional architecture of Japanese business associations. One of the problems is Japanese business associations are seen as dominated by old guys that don't understand the needs of younger people. There is, for some people, for a very small number of people, the way they deal with risk is expanding their business and trying to grow their business. So there are entrepreneurial people here. I think when I do this, if I were to do this research in Shanghai, I think 80% of the people I've talked to in Shanghai are entrepreneurial. They want to expand their business. They want to create a chain. They want to see their business grow. In the neighborhood I'm talking about, I would say only 20% of the people talk that way. So 80% of the people are totally content running this one tiny little business, and that's it. Very few are in this idea of business expansion. But the ones who want to expand, their idea is that I can grow my business, and by creating an economy of scale, of course, then I could be profitable and have a real, a comfortable life. And then finally, I think there's the structural context here is really important. And this is somewhat problematic. So we see throughout Tokyo a decline in formal business associations. We see really a privatization of social infrastructure. And what we see is most of these people are very much vulnerable small businesses, and there's still a high turnover. So it isn't the case that this is somehow a utopia where everybody is doing extremely well. But on the other hand, within, and I probably didn't make the point clear, but like this, within 800 meters of this station, there are 560 places you can sit down and eat. So there is a real incredible density of small businesses there. So in some senses, it is still thriving despite really the threats of urban redevelopment, to some extent increased rent, and the greatest threat of all, which I'd say is aging society, as these people age and just simply can't keep doing these jobs. So I want to talk a little bit about, so that's the ethnography. And if you want to ask me a bit more about it, I have a lot more to say, but I wanted to go on to this question then of what we do with ethnography and what I think of as public ethnography, because I absolutely did not start out as a public ethnographer. I was working in Shanghai, and when I was in Shanghai in 1993, I was told that you keep your nose down and you don't talk to the media and you write your work, because going public and getting involved in the media is going to get you in lots of trouble. And so I was in Shanghai very much focused on doing my ethnography as an academic and writing for academic presses and writing for the international audience. And I never really wrote for the local Shanghai communities that I was studying. And even though I became very close to many people in, say, Yangpu over here on the other side of the river, that was sort of my community. I never really was able to speak to the people in Yangpu, and I felt very bad about that. So I wanted to do public ethnography and share my work. I think we tend to think of Tokyo as being a really top-down city. There's a beautiful book that I urge, if you're interested in Tokyo, you'd probably have seen this, but if you haven't, you should take a look at it. It's called The Emergent Tokyo, and it's about how Tokyo is so different from Shanghai, really. If there's I'd say in that sense that you have these incredible density of small spaces. That's what I've been talking about. These tiny micro spaces that foster then what the authors here are talking about as emergent Tokyo, this emergence of small businesses out of tiny spaces. And I guess what I felt was that what they're missing, and these are my friends, and I think it's a beautiful book and it's absolutely wonderful work. But what they're missing, in my view, is I think the processes of imagining the city. The processes whereby the city is not simply emergent out of planning or social spaces or architecture, really, or the physical environment, but is really kind of a sort of what I call a sort of social phenomenology of physical space, lived experience, and imagination. So this interaction between the physical environment, these tiny micro spaces, and then an urban life world, the experience of those spaces, the direct experience of being Nami-san's customer, which you cannot replicate just by talking about it. You have to be squeezed into this tiny little restaurant. I mean, in her restaurant, you're squeezed in, and when somebody goes to the restroom, everybody leaves the restaurant because somebody, you can't get out otherwise, and then everybody goes back into the restaurant. So it's this compression, that life world, but there's also something else, and that is the urban imaginary, the way in which you already sort of know what you're getting yourself into when you go into these spaces. And that's the part that I wanted to talk a little bit about. So this is the ethnography, which is a really fairly traditional web page, but it's a big web page because we write really long form ethnographies or long form articles about each of the restaurants. And I did this starting 10 years ago as a way of connecting to the community in a way that I felt was impossible here in Shanghai. And through that, I started getting involved in community events. So we started going to festivals where we would also talk about our project and get people to sort of also participate in mapping out the neighborhood. We did maps on paper where people would draw, what they liked about the neighborhood. This got us some recognition by the government as kind of, we're contributing to the society, which was beginning of us in the neighborhood sort of being seen. Then we became part of other sort of communities that were planning things. So one of the interesting things, this is something called the Nishiogi Kuso Keikaku, which is sort of the Nishiogi, sort of imagining a new Nishiogi. So as people thinking about the city being a place of change, the city is not going to stay the same. What can we do to make it a better place? And we had this chance for all of us to imagine Nishiogi. And we participated by imagining Nishiogi as a multicultural town. And this sort of an imagining of our little neighborhood as a multicultural town, we were the absolute only people that mentioned migration at all, ever in our little town. So I began to realize that this was something, and I'll come back to this, but this is the part that I realized that we could play a role in, because there's so many people participating in imagining our town, because it is a bit like Brooklyn, and I didn't get into this that much, but there are lots of people writing about this. Well, I will talk a bit about it. I'll come back to that. So we also got involved in neighborhood political action. One of the things that's going on in our neighborhood is this threat of redevelopment, and which is basically a road widening plan, which will destroy then the physical environment that I'm talking about. So this is led by the city government to plan to widen the road. And this is organized then by a bunch of people that are from small businesses. So the small business community then, so this is a portable izakaya from one of the restaurants. And so they're trying to get young people involved in this, because young people aren't usually involved in politics. So you do things like having a DJ on the street, a portable izakaya. They sold Taiwan pijiu. I don't know, because it's a very connected to this Taiwanese community over there in Koenji. And they also had a Chinese dragon actually in the parade, and that was part of their thing too. So there was an element. The Koenji crowd is a little bit more multicultural. And so the development, the idea was let's elect a mayoral candidate or a chuzhang in Chinese, or a kucho in Japanese, the Tsuganami-ku mayor, who would then be against redevelopment and be more on the side of small business. And so we were actually able to elect a very liberal anti-redevelopment mayoral candidate just by a few votes. And it was mobilizing the young people to vote in this local election. So her name is Kishimoto Satoko, and she is part of a sort of grassroots democracy movement in Europe for 20 years. So she's actually a very cosmopolitan person. And she's the only mayoral candidate I ever heard talking about multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism in the community. So she's quite an interesting Japanese politician, almost unique. So the community then, I think, is represented a lot through consumer media. And so one of the ways in which, politics is actually done, so there are people, as I said, there's people on the street doing these demos, but that's not most people. Most people are approaching the neighborhood through consumer food media. So coming back to food is really a major medium whereby people engage with urban space. So if you think about where people think about our neighborhood, where the ordinary Japanese, when they're going to talk about it, it's like, it's a place I can go eat interesting food in these tiny little restaurants. So this is becoming visible. Our neighborhood has become visible as a foodie neighborhood. And this sort of Shidiwa or Nishiyogi Kubo, the right-hand side, is often connected then to Jishangsi or Kichijoji, the much more famous neighborhood next door. And so these things that are, I think, part of the sort of urban imaginaries of food. So food becomes a medium for accessing the city. I think food media becomes a way in which we actually experience the city. And in a sense, not necessarily tasting the food, but actually sort of just imagining what it's going to be like to be there. And internet media are important. I know many young people today study internet media, but this started with magazines. So magazines are still important in Japan. So believe it or not. So print media still matter. Actually, we have so much dense print media in our neighborhood. We have many people that do manga and do magazines and do books about the neighborhood. We even have this whole collection of zines that has been going on for 20 years, Nishiyogi Donburi, and this is it's all sort of hand-drawn medium. So there is a real movement in the community to do hyper-local media that focuses on the community in a medium that is not on the internet, so that only the people in the community are going to participate in it. And then, so as a person doing this, I get drawn into this. So one of the things that I've learned is once you become part of the conversation, you sort of get to be part of that. So I become one of the people writing in this media. So we are actually writing in this magazine about food media with me and another one of the manga artists. And probably the most impactful thing is once you get on to, in Japan, is getting onto television. So we were on this TV show, which is, if you've been in Japan, you know this person called Matsuko Deluxe. And so this is one of the most popular TV shows in the city or in the country. And it's called Matsuko no Shiranai Sekai. And so we were there introducing our neighborhood to Matsuko. And the problem with this, of course, is you become part of entertainment. You actually, the danger of this is that you lose control of your own message, right? I mean, if you're on television, on mass media, where it's like, this is about an audience of 2 million people for each show. And so it reaches a lot of people, and you're not sure when you go on this kind of program whether your message is going to get across. So I thought about this when I was going on the show, because I knew that the whole point of the show is to make you look ridiculous. And they did that successfully. But I wanted to emphasize a few points, and I realized that you can. So I think that I was able to emphasize women entrepreneurs. So they let me choose the people to introduce. So I introduced Nami-san. So she was on the show. So let's talk about women entrepreneurs in our neighborhood. But I wanted to make sure that 2 of the 3 entrepreneurs I introduced were migrant entrepreneurs, because I know that in our representations of Japanese communities, migrants are never represented as ordinary members of the community. They're extraordinary members of the community. So these are just women that happen to be migrants who are running micro businesses in the neighborhood. So one of them is Chinese and one of them is Korean, and we were able to get them onto the show. And for me, that was just the success of representation. So to make sure that people could see, oh, this is a very typical Japanese yokocho, or a neighborhood, but these are in fact migrants. So what did I learn from doing this kind of public ethnography is that you yourself, in the end, become part of creating what the community is. You're not simply studying the community. You end up kind of producing it. And what I also realized is as you produce this knowledge, you're almost never doing anything original. You're recycling tropes that have been around for a very, very long time. And I was amazed to find that many of the tropes I was recycling were decades old. I mean, they had been circulating in the neighborhood a long time. So there's a kind of layering of community lore that you're just participating in. That's kind of humbling in that sense. But I do believe one of the things is that we do have a certain amount of agency. So even though we are recycling tropes and we're recycling knowledge, we do have agencies. And I think that the agency that we were able to exercise in this project is to try to do something to represent migrants as part of a Japanese neighborhood. And so that's really where the project is going now. I do believe that in this political moment in Japan where we have a real rise of the right wing and the Sanseito, the right-wing political party that's gained power, and we have even Takaichi, the prime minister, is also rather right-wing and somewhat anti-migrant, that we have a really important role in representing migrants as normal parts of what is in fact not an extraordinary like ethnic enclave, but rather what is in fact seen by many people as the most prototypical Japanese community. This old post-war yokocho built up in the 1940s and 50s. And this is, so we're kind of developing then this new project to kind of do some of that. And so that's sort of where I'll end up, is hopefully this will be successful and we'll able to make some more progress with that. Thank you.
I won't hog the space, but I will start with one question, which I was thinking as you started in the first half was like a selfish question, but then as you went on, it's actually, I think, very relevant to what you were saying, which is like, as a foreigner who doesn't speak Japanese, and I go to Tokyo and I want to go into one of those restaurants, what's the sort of vibe when you like, is it okay? Or, you know, when you're going into some space, a tiny space, and someone's maybe talking about their, you know, personal problems, or it's a very community space or a very, yeah, someone's living room. Is it encouraged, discouraged? Is it, yeah, to, as a tourist to go into these places? And I think that's related to the second half. You're saying the community is being promoted as a foodie place, and right? So yeah, how does that play? Can I go eat in your favorite restaurants is basically what I'm asking.
Yeah, I do believe it. It does come back to one of the, there are problems with what we're doing. And I really probably wanted to get into that a bit more. I mean, the danger of going on television, and that was actually controversial, by the way. I mean, appearing on this TV show, there were people in my neighborhood who were like, why are you doing this? This is bad for us because you're bringing in all of these people into the neighborhood and we don't want them. You know, we don't want those strangers coming in here, ruining our favorite places. So you really do have to choose the places to introduce carefully. You really want to make sure that the places you introduce want those customers. So the Korean woman and the Chinese woman, they love having new people. They're very much like, oh, more is better. You know, so I knew they would love it. And Nami-san actually likes being on TV. So And she's and those old places aren't doing that well. So even though there is a danger of us destroying the neighborhood, they're always happy to have business. So it's one of the problems with this is that the system is so fragile because in some ways these are businesses that are not doing that well, and so they always want new customers. So if you're going to be there and be a good customer, they're super happy to have you because almost none of them feel they're doing very well and making enough money. But at the same time, what they don't want you doing is probably walking in with like 3 loud students from NYU and then, sort of taking over the restaurant for one evening and sort of ruining the environment and then leaving. So what's the best way to go to a restaurant like that, to answer your question directly, is alone. If you go alone, you're almost never going to have a problem. If you go with one other person, you're okay. If you go with 3, you're probably going to cause a hassle at a place like that. It's just so if you're talking loudly, and if you want to have a conversation with your friend, don't go. If you want to be there to be with other people, go. I mean, when I take my foreign friends out, I usually only take them to Nami-san's place because she'll talk to them no matter what language they speak. She always figures out a way of talking to them, even if she doesn't speak anything but Japanese, but she can always communicate.
Yeah, I think that this issue about visibility and concealment and how to keep hidden, especially in a environment of like Wanghong urbanism is really important. But if others have questions, please let us know. Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate your talk, and I really enjoyed it, actually. I also went to Tokyo. I love it at kind of culinary culture, yokocho, whatever, mentioned in the presentation. And one of my favorite TV show is, I think, I don't know how it's translated in English, but that that, I think, Godoku no Gurume. Yeah, it was so big TV show in South Korea, my home country. And for that reason, I think so many South Korean tourists also go to, like when they go to Tokyo or Osaka, they just go to like Yokocho or some of the kind of the secret alleys where you just hang out. And probably I think some reason that they just go there, enjoy the culture is like in this kind of the neighborhood you visited, I think this kind of the community building, the kind of the sense of the togetherness, I think missing in South Korean kind of the similar design, kind of the urban environment, I think. I think probably also visited South Korea and many other East Asian countries. But then in my understanding, kind of this kind of sense of like togetherness and community building is very unique and stand out in Japan. And may I ask why Japan is like that compared to other East Asian countries?
Yeah, that's a pretty tough question, really. I think it's a good one. It's what motivated this in many ways, because as Anna said, I started this in Shanghai. I felt that it was rather different. So one comes back to what I noticed really clearly is when Chinese young people talk to me about the restaurant business, there were two or three types of people, but it's largely you have working class people that become cooks. And in the context of, say, Shanghai, they would be migrant workers from all over China, and they're really struggling. They're really just trying to make a living. And then you have the people that want to run a business. These are urban people that want to do a business, and they're entrepreneurs. And these working class people work for these entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs want to create something like what they're seeing in Tokyo, but they're doing it with these working class people working in a restaurant. And what's going to happen in Tokyo is that in fact, it's really these middle class people are dropping out and they're doing it themselves. So it's really this incredibly small scale of this that means because you're doing it face to face and because you're actually providing the service yourself, that interface becomes much more direct. So it is this culture of kind of doing it yourself and low expectations. I mean, really, it's in some ways, I would say the result of Japan, having had very low economic growth for 30 years, has produced this culture of people being satisfied, just getting along, just getting by. And so it's multiple things. To some extent, it's a pride in work, and people feel that being a shokunin is good. I mean, it's upstanding. Whereas I think in the Chinese context, if you're a middle class person, becoming a cook is that's a pretty big leap. I mean, for a lot of parents, they'd be very upset if you did that. If you did your NYU degree and you become a chef, I think a lot of parents would be upset. But I think in Japan, less so. And then the other thing really is a lower expectation. And then the other thing is simply this consciousness of the tiny scale of social life that people are comfortable with. And then the other thing is the culture of eating out. I mean, for me, I find it still, after all these years, somewhat incredible that people would go to the same tiny little restaurant twice a week for 20 straight years. You know, that there's a sense of loyalty to a membership, this very, very strong membership culture. And that's something I see in Japan that's not here. I mean, China's a rather different society. I can't speak to Korea as much, but I certainly see a vast difference between China and Japan on all these dimensions.
But maybe I can just follow up, like, it seems like the problem that this is a response to is very pervasive. I mean, maybe not even only in East Asia, like all over the world, right? An increasing isolation, an increasing atomization, and that there is an urban space that is providing community and care. And so, yeah, I was wondering also during your talk, like, are these just these very particular conditions, or is there anything, if you were like, okay, this is how I would encourage it, or this is what I would try if I was trying to recreate it or encourage it elsewhere, what are the necessary conditions? Or is it really just there's too much and it's just about that particular place?
Well, no, I don't believe it's, I mean, so the emergent Tokyo authors are insistent that this is not some sort of distinctive Japanese thing. So their answer, and it's not a bad answer, is that it's urban planning. It really is about having lots of very small, cheap rental spaces all over the city. So if you're able to lower rents and keep these tiny little spaces available, if you were to do this in any city, you would have emergent culture. That's their answer. And I think, I mean, that's not, you know, totally wrong, but I don't think it's enough. And I'm not sure it would work. I'm not sure it would work everywhere. I'm not sure it would work here, but then again, when I'm in like Shanghai and I'm like walking around Hongkou, Gongyuan over there, I'm staying over there, and there's so many micro spaces inside the city park. So here, what you see is a lot of emergent social spaces in public space. And you have all these old folks playing badminton or old folks dancing. And I mean, so you have an incredible amount of micro publics here emerging in non-commercial environments. So I don't think you see that as much in Japan, for example. So I think in Japan, it's taking a more commercial form, and in Shanghai, it's taking a more non-commercial form. But I will say this, in Shanghai, the older people are very good at this. I'm not so sure the young people. So the young people are doing everything online. And this movement to everything being online, I think, is really powerful in China. And I do believe in Japan, there is a little bit more of the face-to-face world still resilient. It's a little bit more resilient, maybe. But again, that is also largely a I mean, many people in Tokyo will say the world that I'm talking about is a middle-aged phenomenon as well. So, you know, are young people attracted to this? I certainly introduce my students to this and I bring them to it, and they're intrigued by it, but it's unfamiliar to them.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, Professor. I have a small comment and then a question. So the business you described in your presentation somehow reminds me of this family-run small bars or restaurants in Guangdong province. So it does sounds similar, like they open the restaurant. It's not really a restaurant, it's just someone like in the village or on the street, like in the neighborhood, and like the father or the mother, they cook really well, and then the word began to spread in the neighborhood, and then people living in a neighborhood becomes aware of the information, and then they would come and ask for food, and then it eventually evolved into a small restaurant that is only known to the local people. And then as the internet become more and they spread the word, and it's exactly the same situation as you described in your presentation. The local people become really upset that the internet spread the word. It's like, we don't really want that many customers, and the owner would sometimes they would even complain to their customers' face. It's like, you people, like, we really cannot handle this influx of customers. We can only cook for like 10 or 20 people a day, and then like, you guys, please stop posting about our small restaurant on the internet. And that is just my observance. That's my small comment. And my question would be, like, these type of family-owned small business, they are not so sustainable because children of these family-owned restaurant, they usually do not want to continue what their father or mother wants to do. That is the case in in Guangdong area. I want to know, like, how sustainable are these bars, local bars you described in your presentation? Because some of them, it seems like the shop owner, they don't really have anyone to pass their business on to. And do we have a very steady, influx of new, starters into this business how sustainable is this business?
Always interested in hearing about similar types of examples. And I felt that in Shanghai in the 1990s, there were many more places like this. When I was here in the 90s, when there were many getihu, and that was kind of emerging in China in that period. But that sort of getihu culture kind of is replaced by this sort of, basically urban redevelopment here in this city. And I feel that, look, I think that the question about how people cope, I mean, the other thing is how people cope with that is interesting. So when I do this, many people say no, they don't want to be on television, so they're not on television. And some people don't even want to be on my webpage, so they're not on that either, because they don't want to have new customers. But the question of having someone to take over your business is very critical. And this is a kind of, people see this as a problem of our generation, of our era. So the older businesses from the 1940s and 50s, the business model would have been owner-operated real estate. So you would have owned the whole building, a family might have lived there. And there was a sense that restaurants were more sustainable because you'd have your family living there, you'd be able to support your entire family with the business, and then people would have children. They'd also have big families. So, most kids don't want to take over the business, but maybe one of them would. So we do have in the neighborhood the old type of restaurant, which are soba restaurants. So, chao mai mian, and soba is those can be 3 generations or 4 generations old, and they're almost all disappearing too because they don't have enough kids. But they did last for those 3 or 4 generations. And in the middle of the city, you have 10-generation restaurants in Tokyo. I mean, Japan has more really, really old businesses than any other country in the world. And that is because people do find ways of handing them down to people they adopt. So one of the ways that they do this is they adopt people into the family. So they'll just take over somebody. One of their workers that really loves the restaurant, they'll just give it to them essentially. And we do see that in the neighborhood. So one of my restaurants, in fact, the picture that they put on the cover of the poster, that's a guy that was basically given the restaurant by the owners because he was such a great worker, and they let him take over. And so that's a very common model. It's kind of it's not formal adoption. He's not actually adopted as to a son, but he's basically given the restaurant. So there's that model. Then there's simply closing it down and renting it out to somebody else. But and throughout the post-war period, migrants from all over Japan filled in the gap. But nowadays, without international migration, the gap's not going to be filled. So only through having more international migrants that's my answer, is that these are the people that are willing to run businesses in Japan. So right now it's, Nepalese. So we have many, many more Nepalese coming. And so that's the biggest group of entrepreneurs. And we're getting more and more people from Southeast Asia. We had a lot of people from China, still do. But this is without migrants, I don't think, and without Japan opening up to more migrants, there's not enough people, because the sheer scale of this is enormous, the number of businesses. Just too many small businesses.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. It was kind of surprising, but I guess not so surprising to hear how small the margin was that many of these small businesses were able to achieve. And that made me wonder about the relationship between the proprietors. If they are packed in these very small neighborhoods, they probably know of each other. And I'm wondering, do they see each other as competitors, or do they see each other as, you know, somewhat of a complicated member of the same community? And so that's my first question. My second question comes from your earlier comment about the loyalty of the patrons. You know, this person has been going to the same restaurant twice a week for 20 years. And now I'm wondering, well, would it be seen as disloyal if that member would patronize other kind of places, either within the same neighborhood or beyond that?
There's a lot of micro politics of this in the neighborhood. So because Nami-san is the sort of godmother of the neighborhood these days, and she's given me a lot of the history. So back in the day, there was something called the Inshokuten Kumiai, which is sort of the Inshiden Zuhe or Zuchi. And that is like basically the Eat and Beverage Association. It was all women, they all joined. And they said back in the 1950s when it was created, and her story, which people don't usually say, is that it was created to protect the businesses from American soldiers. That they were so bad that they basically wanted to create. I mean, her story is that this is a self-protection organization. That's not the official story. The official story is it's a business association. So but she said back everybody joined. So in the day, every single person joined, and and no one was left out. So there was a sort of sense that this type of community really protected its members, and everybody kind of, but there was also a lot of kind of sense, almost like coercion in a way. You really had to follow the rules of the community. And a lot of people over the decades have become more individualistic. There's a lot more variance in the type of people owning businesses. There's more men and more young people and just different types of people. And all of that organization has completely disappeared. So in her view, and the view of a lot of people, there's sort of anomie. I mean, there's a kind of lack of social organization in the community. And then you talk to somebody like Meg, this young woman, and she sees this as an opportunity to create new forms of social organization. And she goes around organizing all sorts of bar hopping events and organizing all sorts of new ways of organizing things. And Nami-san thinks that she's really kind of a little bit uppity and shouldn't be doing that. So there's a real competition between those people in that sense for authority and all that. But people who get along will genuinely let their customers go from bar to bar. But if the owners don't get along and they're seen to be sort of enemies, then yeah, you don't want to be known to go from that place to that place. And if you are formerly a regular customer at a place and you quit going, it's a little bit like meeting your ex-girlfriend or boyfriend. It's very embarrassing. People really treat it like a form of betrayal, I would say. I mean, there are places that I used to be a regular at, and I think they just treat it like, why did you stop coming here? You broke up with us. You don't like us anymore. And they will just ignore you. They won't say there is a really kind of emotional component to it as far as I can tell with people. Yes. To me, it's rather awkward as a field worker.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. My first question would be, what kind of motivation for the owner to open this kind of neighborhood restaurant? I've watched documentary, it just stressed the revenue just covers the cost, but the owner really want to create the space for the community because it involve like high school classmates and so many. If she shut down this restaurant and they can go nowhere, so it's kind of sense of belongings, achievement, or even more. But I'm not so sure the situation in Tokyo. That's my first question. And my second question would be, actually, I just come back from Tokyo 2 days ago. I met so many people, but I do find some difference between elderly people and young people. The elderly, they're so welcoming, even they couldn't speak English, but they're trying even some simple words or use forms, whatever. But young people looks like poker face. And they don't really care. So I'm not so sure. Well, for this kind of neighborhood restaurant, it's like mostly owned or opened by elderly people or young people, and I just want to confirm my experience. Was the difference between elderly and young people?
Try to answer both parts of that. I mean, in terms of people's motives, I suppose my message of this is that people's motives really are partly about community care. I know it sounds, maybe it sounds very idealistic, but I think almost everybody has to some extent, a non-commercial motive. There are rare individuals who really are doing this just purely for commercial reasons. Now, someone like Nami, on the other hand, I think she, as the more traditional type of entrepreneur in that neighborhood, so the traditional entrepreneur that founded that community were single women who were refugees from Manchukuo, from like Dongbei. There were all these people returning who were widows of Japanese soldiers. These were women who had no husbands. There were women who were basically who had come back to, say, Shanghai, all these people that had come back from the mainland, from basically the Japanese empire collapsing, and this, which was, of course, Japan's own doing and all that. But nonetheless, it was for these people very drastic and horrible circumstances. And so that's the story. So all of these women doing it out of desperation. I would say in the old days, it was desperation capitalism. And by Nami's generation, she's a working class woman. She has 3 kids. She has no husband. Almost a lot of the women are in that situation, but she really is not a desperate person. So she has a sense of her own resources and autonomy, and definitely is doing it out of out of volition, but she's not a university educated person or something like that. And then there's the new group that I was focusing on in the early part of the presentation, which are the people doing this because they're dropping out of white collar work. And almost all of them are saying, I'm going to give up on a higher standard of living and take a lower standard of living in order to do what I think is a more meaningful thing. And many of them are willing to live a very, very, very low level of, sort of personal material and life, and they sort of live inside the business. So the business is their hobby, it's their life. They spend all their time there. That's their friendship circle, and that's it. So that is their life, and so they really don't expect very much economically. Do they really have a chance to I suppose, take care of each other? I suppose, when I think about the sort of economics of it, it's complicated. There are quite a few people whose relatives are subsidizing them. Quite a few people who, I think, especially women whose husbands have full-time corporate jobs. And so they're doing this as kind of a hobby. And you do have sometimes the other. You have men who do this and their wives have corporate jobs. So you have that. And then finally, your question about age and how people treat you. It definitely is the case that you definitely find older people are more chatty and sociable. I mean, they grew up in an age in which strangers talk to each other in Tokyo. Tokyo is a very chatty place in the old period. I mean, so once you're in there, I mean, I think many of them, that's what they're used to. They're used to this more verbal communication. But not everybody, because there is a certain type of image of the old guy working in these restaurants, especially the men, who they don't say anything. They're just making their stuff and they're just like, here, eat that. You know, there's no nice service at all. So there is that type. Other than that type of old-fashioned, cook, I'd say a lot of people are very friendly. And then younger people, I think, are generally find it, they're not as used to that world of random sociability in general. And this is, to me, a typical pattern in Tokyo. Yeah. It's easier to, if I go to the like neighborhood events where the 70 and 80-year-old people are, it's easy to talk. My neighborhood, there's a lot of.
Is there a last question? Okay.
Thank you. I have also two questions. First, in which scale or situation care in your concept tend to be emotional labor? Actually, you already mentioned it in the care as contextualizing. So that's his first question. My second question is a little related to his first question, but I tend to it more theoretical way. So in which point or scale the neighbor care in your case is from gift in a Marcel Mauss term to turn into community in a Karl Marx term. So I think in your case, maybe the tension between gift and the community extends always. How can you do with it in your empirical and theoretical building? That is my question. Thank you.
I mean, the question of scale, if I understand it, is where does care extend? And I do believe that care can be very much, for some people, it just extends only to their own business and their own customers. And there are people for whom care extends to cross the community and really do a lot of work in the community. And the people organizing community, like the guy who organized that protest, I mean, he owns a small business and he organized that entire protest. He's organized protests once a month. He loves to organize protests. So he's sort of a kind of social movement entrepreneur. And his sense of care is all about the community. He talks about the community all the time. So there are people for whom I think the concept of care for them is very much, I think it's multi-scalar, and it goes from the micro level up to the mid level, but it doesn't extend to the larger national level. No one talks about caring for Japan or Aigwa. There's not a single bit of anything really. I think it's rare to people talk about the country or even the city. It's really interesting they don't talk about Tokyo. I've never heard anybody talk about Tokyo. They only talk about Nishiyogi-Kubo. So the scale is very much very local, very particular. And there might be something about the Tuosen as kind of the Zhongyangshen. Well, I mean, that's kind of our cultural sphere, but that's more of a cultural sphere. It's not there's not an emotional attachment to it. So I think that's the question of scale is really interesting one, but it is about local scale. And it can be very protectionist. I mean, during COVID, for example, people would say, we don't want people from Ogikubo coming to Nishi-Ogikubo. They'll spread COVID. So they're talking about people from the next neighborhood over coming to eat here, and they don't want them. So there's really a sense of neighborhood as a unit. The way in which this is sort of commodified, yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is in a sense commodified, but I suppose that is sort of built into the package is the way people see it. It's a little bit like a contract. I mean, you do all this sort of care and then you basically give people a bill and they're expected to kind of, it's a sort of mutual, you're supposed to be supporting that person. So there really is a sense in which if you're a good customer, like if you're seen as kind of a well-off person, like I am as a university professor, I'm supposed to go to Nami-san's place and eat good food and spend money. I'm supposed to be taking care of her. So there's a sense of mutual care, and but that's mutual. It's always, I think, a mutual relationship. So the care should go both ways. In that sense, I don't believe it's purely it's not like I'm paying for her care, but it's rather I'm supposed to be taking care of the restaurant, and we should be responsible. So if you're not being a regular customer, you're kind of irresponsible. So the notion that I can simply go there and buy this service is not really the mentality I think that people see. I don't think that's how people largely perceive it. I think they largely see it as a mutual care. And they certainly, during COVID, this came out very clearly as customers felt the need to support businesses by basically doing a lot of things for them and keeping them afloat.
Okay, thank you so much.